This video does not contain spoilers, but I do outline the general thematic arcs of the books. I want to talk about two novels I read in the past few months, A Son of the Circus by John Irving and St. Urbain's Horseman by Mordecai Richler. I'm not going to get into the background of these books or their authors. To be honest, I know little about them. The one seems somewhat obscure outside of Canada, and with the other one, who apparently has had several of his books adapted into major films, the work I'm discussing today does not seem to be one of his all-time greatest hits. I've never read any other books by them, and I might not ever. The only thing I'll say about the authors that they have in common is they are both Canadians in some way or another, and both of their main protagonists in these stories are upper-middle-class professional Canadians trying to come to terms with their self-abandoned heritage. So the book that was published first, St. Urbain's Horseman, is basically about a Jewish Canadian TV and film director living in England named Jacob Hirsch. Haunting the tale of his journey from Yiddishkeit in the Canadian sticks to being a big-time industry hotshot is a Pinchonian ghost of his cousin, whom Jacob imagines to be some kind of anti-Nazi Jewish avenger traipsing around the world. The main point of the book is, as I understand it, and keep in mind I did not study English literature in college, a discussion of the reaction of then-modern Jewry. Do people still say Jewry? Is that anti-Semitic? Or is it just old-fashioned, like Christendom? Then-modern Jews to living their lives in the shadow of the Holocaust. At some level, Jacob feels like his worldly success, including beautiful blonde Gentile wife, has an inherent triviality to it, and thus feels the need to transform his long-lost, philandering, alcoholic, debt-accruing cousin, who is even more selfish than Jacob is, into some kind of vision of the moral Jewish life. And of course, this gets him into real-world trouble. The second book is Son of the Circus by John Irving. The story is about Farooq Daruwala, a doctor from an Indian religious minority, married to an Austrian wife and living in Toronto. While on a visit to India, the doctor gets involved in the case of an Indian serial killer, resettles some orphans in a circus, and deals with a self-important American missionary who is unaware that he is a twin brother of the doctor's adopted son, who is also the most famous actor in Mumbai, famous for the role he plays in films written by the doctor anonymously, and honestly, I'm going to stop explaining there. Okay, so there are thematic parallels between the books, but the real reason I want to compare these books is their structure. These two are some of the most folded up books I have ever read. What do I mean by that? Take St. Urbain's Horseman. And I told you what the book is about, the life of Jacob Hirsch, but almost all of that takes place in flashback. The only presently happening parts of the story are the very beginning, the very end. In the first couple dozen pages, it's established that Hirsch is under criminal charges for some kind of sex crime, being a co-defendant with one Harry Stein. And then there's 300 pages about Jacob's entire life, which includes but vastly engulfs the story of how he came to know Stein. Then all of a sudden, we are at the end. The trial is happening, it is resolved rather quickly, and that's that. It's only around page 100 or so, as we find out about Hirsch's troubles entering America due to his political activities as a student, that you realize that we are not going to be weaving in and out of the courtroom and Hirsch's background. The events that play out in court are an important denouement and are informative for our final judgment of Hirsch's character as readers, but it is ultimately just the last in a series of episodes summing up Hirsch's life. To say that St. Urbain's Horseman is a courtroom novel sounds like a bit of a joke. Son of the Circus' structure follows a pattern at the same time more and less expected. Probably about half the book takes place in the current time of the story, and it is woven back and forth with extensive flashbacks detailing the past of various characters. But it approaches the strangeness of St. Urbain's Horseman structure for the sheer involvement of these flashbacks. I mean, the book is about 600 pages long. The longest of the flashbacks is over 100 pages. They go on for whole sections. This gives a very strange sense of time in the book, especially in the beginning as you're getting used to it. A simple morning at a country club, admittedly one where a grisly murder scene is discovered, takes place over 100 pages because every time the doctor meets someone, says something, sees something, enters a room, there's a new crease in the story for the narrative to slip into for a while. This reaches its somewhat ridiculous epitome when the doctor checks his voicemail. There are several messages, and it takes a long, long time to go through every message and every reverie that it invokes. Now, I should say here, these are not really framed stories, but we have to ask ourselves, why make the distinction of present time and flashback time? Flashback we are reading is just as realistically happening as is what we're experiencing in the book's present, but it's an important distinction because it plays with the reader's perception of time in the narratives. St. Urbain's Horseman, the more literary and pretentious, I say that as a compliment, of the two, is actually the more conservative in this aspect. The introduction and conclusion of the trial neatly bookend the narrative, with only the occasional reference popping up to it in the middle, like Hirsch's disastrously fecal visit to his attorney's house for dinner. But it does play on your expectations. Be clear, it's not just that we're awaiting the action of the trial for 300 pages, but we're awaiting any details about what is supposed to have happened. Who's accusing Hirsch, and of what exactly? What's the connection with Stein? All we really know from the beginning is that a joke script of Hirsch's involving taboo sexual and political subjects has been seized as evidence. Here the reader might be tricked into thinking Hirsch is suffering for his self-expression, the victim of overreaching obscenity laws. The script is about a Nazi invasion of Britain, portraying the Nazis as protagonists. Is Hirsch really being punished from a symbolic perspective because of the anti-Semites' desire to deride Jews as unloyal aliens? The answer is no. But the reader does not know that until, in a rush, the details of the case are uncovered, the case ends abruptly, and we piddle-paddle with the consequences for a few pages. Ultimately, the narrative structure is successfully projected against the backdrop of Hirsch's entire life. The legal scrape he gets himself into is made to look small, incongruous, as out of joint with who he feels himself to be. Notice, of course, I said looks like, because whether it actually is up to the reader's interpretation. The actual action of the story happens so fast as to be disorientating, and we go from total mystified suspense to climax so fast that it seems a little bit empty. But it's a clever construction, because ultimately Hirsch's main problem is his regret for the empty center of his life. Regardless of what happens at trial, it convicts him of the charges he has accused himself of. Son of the Circus is more almost, but not quite, experimental in its structure. In his preface, Irving mentions how his first submitted draft came out to 1,000 pages. On one hand, I kind of pity his editor, but on the other hand, part of me believes that the extra 400 pages would have been just as strong as the 600 we do get. Here, the chopping up of time feels less intentful, less connected to any kind of theme of the novel, and is more just there because Irving needs to explain everything that is going on and why every single character does what they do. The arc of the American missionary is demonstrative. In the beginning of the novel, he is set to arrive in India that night. Naturally, that night doesn't actually happen until halfway through the entire book. This is after an 80-page detour into how his parents met. Now, this is a man who is temperamentally completely unsuited for India, and there is a promise of a big payoff because, I won't get into the details, but basically the twin brother he doesn't know exists is a famous Bollywood actor, right? We actually get very little hijinks from him in India. The payoff never comes, which is okay, and he mostly does two things in the novel: prod the doctor into actions he wouldn't otherwise have taken with the orphans, and falls into reveries about life growing up in the USA. The effect of this all is that the book comes off as somewhat mad, and despite the fact that it's a mess, it's a fun mess. Indeed, there's a certain stimulating challenge in trying to keep straight exactly what the characters are supposed to be experiencing in the house of the distended present time of the narrative, while we've been away outside all day playing. It really feels like a writer pushing a fairly common narrative device, the flashback, as far as he can push it, and really relying only upon it. It makes for an enticing dance of a book, especially because otherwise it's a very traditional novel. Unlike in St. Urbain's Horseman, where ambiguity abounds and in the end it is unclear to the reader whether or not Hirsch is really guilty of the crime he stands accused of, or what the hell his cousin is supposed to have been doing the whole time, Son of the Circus is not that. Everything happens as the author imagines it, and he sees one of his jobs as communicating that to the reader clearly. Therefore, everything really does have to fit together. To push any further on this perpetual interruptive flashback structure would be to turn this into a truly experimental structure. Now, I'm sure there are lots of other books which chop up narrative time in strange ways. I just happened to read these two recently. Notice, though, a book like Slaughterhouse-Five actually doesn't do this. The episodes are achronological from the point of view of world history, but actually inherently deeply chronological from the point of view of Billy Pilgrim. Another book I'm thinking of which does qualify for what I'm talking about might be The False Indian by Abbas Kidder. Everything about his life, which is a straight journey, is told out of order so that, as the author puts it near the end of the book, every chapter can be its own self-contained narrative. So things are ordered thematically, not chronologically, to the point of covering the same events, different times, for different reasons. Are there any books you've read that have some kind of connection to this way of telling a story? Let me know in the comments below.